Unit 2, Part 2 will discuss mainly the political disagreements between the different factions that existed early in American history. Democracy and dissent. Party politics from 1788 to 1800. Uh, the founders of the United States were in general agreement about political parties. They did not like them. Actually, they're nowhere in the Constitution. The Constitution of the United States doesn't even mention political parties. But factions inevitably organize themselves into political parties. And this is what happened in the early years of the Republic. Since both major factions were sure their way was the only way, bitter and sometimes violent disagreements ensued. And as you'll see, we think we have bitter political disagreements today in our politics. Today is really nothing like it was early in our country's history, as we'll see. To put it simply, the political differences were philosophical, and those philosophical differences kind of manifested themselves in two different political parties. The Federalists and the Republicans are sometimes called the Democratic Republicans. Either term is used, but Republicans or Democratic Republicans. First, let's take a look at each. Federalists were led, intellectually at least, led by a man named Alexander Hamilton, who was really one of the underrated political thinkers of the early period of American history. As we'll see later, we might have already talked about him, I don't remember, but he was the first American Secretary of the Treasury under George Washington. But anyway, his philosophy was that the country should actively and quickly pursue integration into the world economy, promote domestic industries, and have a strong national government. Rapid integration into the world economy. Let's go out there, he would say, and trade, uh, and get involved and insert ourselves into the rest of the world and into the world economy. He was an elitist. He distrusted the common man. He felt that people were the more intelligent, the wealthier, the better born were more likely to be better leaders, and that those that were poor or just the common man should follow the lead of those elites. So he distrusted the common man, and he believed in strong national institutions. He believed for the nation to be successful on the world stage, uh, the national government must be dominant, which flies in the face and disagrees with what the Republicans' philosophy was, which was a strong state governments and a weak national government. The Republicans were led by Thomas Jefferson. He had faith in what was known back then as the white yeoman farmer, meaning he believed that farmers who owned their own land would have the most stake in the future of the country, and therefore they should make the majority of the political decisions. People would uh, make decisions in the nation's best interest if they had a stake, and these farmers would have a stake. He distrusted a strong national government. The Republicans remembered clearly life under Great Britain, and they wanted nothing to do with a strong central government like that of Great Britain. So they distrusted the national governments and believed that the state governments were the best vehicle for implementing and promoting policy. And although Jefferson was a wealthy person and liked the finer things in life, he resisted the crass materialism of quote unquote commerce. That making the almighty dollar was the end all be all of everything, and that is what is celebrated. Who is the wealthiest, and who can accumulate the most things. And he thought that was just crass. And now, of course, with the ratification of the new Constitution, that which included a new executive branch and a new judicial branch, the executive branch required the selection of a president. And through the electoral college process, that was stated in the Constitution. George Washington was elected as the first president of the United States. Of course, he was a national hero. He was considered nonpartisan, meaning he was considered above the fray of the battles between the Federalists and the Republicans, or the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Uh, so he was seen as somebody, really the perfect first president, because he did not seem to have a preferred side one way or the other, and that kind of set a precedent, among other precedents, that presidents should kind of be above the political fray. Of course, in modern times, probably beginning with, well, presidents have always been in the political fray, but probably beginning with, 1960s, presidents have become much more political. Uh, but he understood precedent. He did things that he with a mind and with a mindset that future presidents would look back and see what he did and copy him. That's what a precedent means. You do things for the first time and everybody else follows it. And one of the most important precedents that he set, which we'll probably talk about later, is he stepped down after two presidential terms. Of course, in the new Constitution, presidents were elected to four-year terms, but were allowed to run for re-election as many times as they wished. But he chose to step down after two terms and retire to Mount Vernon. But every president after that who served two terms never attempted to run for a third term until Franklin Roosevelt uh, during World War II. Also, he established three executive departments to help him run the country. The Department of War, which is now considered the Department of State. The Department of War, which is now considered the Department of Defense. The Department of State, in which Thomas Jefferson was his first Secretary of State. And the Department of the Treasury. As I mentioned before, Alexander Hamilton was the first Secretary of the Treasury. Now, as far as the judicial branch, which was created in the Constitution, the Judiciary Act of 1789 created the federal judiciary. If you remember, if you're taking government class, the Constitution basically created the Supreme Court, but it gave Congress the power to create the lower courts that would be required to hear most of the cases, most of the federal cases brought before the courts. So they created the federal judiciary in a congressional session of 1789. Also, they needed money. They needed money to run the government. All governments need money to function, and so they implemented a tariff or an import tax to help fund the government. Also funding the government was sale of federal lands. And it says funded company, but it should say funded government. Land sales also funded the government. And that's one thing that the United States had a lot of at this point, all the way up through the Mississippi. That was really unsettled frontier land, and they were able to sell it. And as we saw before in those Northwest Ordinance, helped help facilitate the the settlement and the sale of the land in the frontier. Now, conflicting ideologies lead to conflicting visions and conflicting ideas about the role of the nation, the path the nation should take, and Hamilton and Jefferson had very, very different ideas about the path that this new country, the United States, should take. Hamilton, of course, was the Secretary of Treasury under George Washington. He had long, strong ties with Great Britain. He really admired the British governmental system, even though he was a supporter to an extent of the Revolution. And he believed in independence. He thought that we could adapt many of the British ways to the American system of government and the American economy. But he had very strong ties with Britain, and that's why, later on, a lot of people will accuse him of wanting to make the United States a monarchy. He believed in a strong central government, once again, like Great Britain. He said that is the only way to garner worldwide respect. Other nations will not respect a government or a nation that is a confederation, that has a bunch of smaller, weaker governments and smaller, weaker regional governments and a weak, I mean, smaller, stronger, weak regional governments and a weak central government. He thought that the central government was the primary driver for world respect. He viewed the U.S. as a potential industrial power with all the natural resources that were here, and he feared anarchy more than tyranny. And if you've ever had me in a government class, we talk about order versus freedom, and that's a dilemma of governments. They have to choose which is most important and make laws that project that idea. And so he feared freedom, which is anarchy. Pure freedom is anarchy, and pure order is tyranny. And he feared freedom more than order. He preferred order over freedom, and he distrusted the common man. Jefferson, who was the Secretary of State under Washington, he believed that limited government, not strong government, limited government preserves liberty. He didn't like the idea of a strong government. He preferred, as order. No, he preferred freedom over order. So, order is government power, freedom is citizen power. So he preferred more individual liberty and less rules, less government power. He viewed the U.S. as an agrarian nation, a farming nation, whereas Hamilton saw the future United States as an industrial power. And and this goes back to their view of who they trust. Uh, Hamilton trusts industrialists, the wealthy, the elite. Uh, Jefferson trusted the farmer, the agrarian person, the person that worked the land. He trusted the common man, and he was against deficit spending. Jefferson did not believe that you should borrow money, the government should borrow money to function. Whereas Hamilton, on the other hand, believed that borrowing money actually strengthens the government. He argued that debt can be good because those that hold the debt are going to want to ensure your success in your prosperity. So if another country loans you millions of dollars, that country is going to want to ensure that you prosper and survive as a nation. Therefore, they will have a stake in your success, and therefore they will do everything they can to ensure that your survival, so they can get paid back their debt. Now, early on, Hamilton, as Secretary of the Treasury, recognized the problems that faced the nation, the economic problems. Most importantly, debt. Okay, you had a national debt because they had to borrow a lot of money to fight the Revolutionary War. Uh, the national debt of $54 million, which doesn't seem that much today, but it was a lot of money back then. And the states, cumulatively, all the states together, had $25 million more in debt because they had to borrow money as well to help fund their militias and fund their part of the war. And the tricky part of this is that most of that debt was owned by speculators. Uh, uh, Early on, during the Revolution and prior to the Revolution, the government sold war bonds. Basically, these were these bonds that you would sell to the government. I mean, the government would sell to you, and it was just a loan. So you would give the government $100. The government would give you a bond, and then when the war was over, they would pay you back with interest rate, at least the $100, but with interest added. You were like loaning the government money. Well, during the Articles of Confederation period, when there was a weak national government, that those bonds became worthless because the government could not raise money to pay them back. So people would be willing to sell their $100 bond for whatever they could get because they feared eventually that it would be worth nothing. So they might sell it because the value of it was going down. They might sell it for $50 or $20 or $10. And by the crisis point during the Articles of Confederation period, people were getting 10 cents on the dollar for their debt. And so that $100 bond was selling for $10. Now, what happened was some people, called speculators, saw this as an opportunity. They were going to gamble that eventually the debt would be repaid at a higher value, or at least, or maybe full value. So speculators began going all around the country buying up this low price debt. So they'd buy $100 bonds from people for $10 with the hope that maybe they could end up getting $20 for them or $30. So most of this debt, most of this national debt was owned by speculators here in the United States. Now, so this was a problem they had to address. Now, to address these problems, Hamilton issued quite a few reports laying out his plans for fixing the economy and the direction for the economy. He issued three: report on public credit, which is debt, report on banking, and the report on manufacturers. He also argued for with a report on funding and assumption, funding and assumption, and this was a way to address the problem of the debt. First of all, he said the government would buy back all the debt at face value. Now, this is very important and very controversial because all those speculators, which are generally wealthy people to begin with, that are risking their money, all these speculators went around and bought these $100 bonds at $10. All those people are now going to get $100 for each of those bonds, or 500, or however much the initial bond was valued at. So they made huge, huge profits, and this greatly angered the original bondholders, the original debt holders. They felt that somehow they should be compensated as well because they paid the initial or loaned the initial $100 to the government. But according to Hamilton, these should all be redeemed at face value. The federal government would also assume state debts because most of the debt was accumulated by the states in the process and in the attempt to win the war. The government would assume the debt. Both of these were very, very controversial because some states, accumulated lots and lots of debt. Others, not so much. And so the ones that accumulated lots of debt got a better deal because the federal government was just going to, or the national government was just going to write it off basically and say, okay, it's not your debt anymore, it's ours. And those that were more frugal, the states that did a better job of handling their money, they were in some ways kind of punished because, they didn't have any debt that they could get rid of. Now, another thing Hamilton wanted to do was establish a national bank. Okay, he wanted to establish a national bank, but he wanted to establish a national bank that was basically privately owned but government funded. He didn't believe that politicians who he thought would be most concerned with the next election should be in charge of the the currency or the money in the economy, because he believed they would manipulate that. Politicians would manipulate for their short-term benefit to get reelected, which could have long-term negative consequences on the economy. He thought private banks who benefit from long-term stability and profit in the long term from a stable economy should control the currency. So it should be funded by the government. The government should put up the money, and it's government currency, but the actual policies, fiscal policies, or not, the policies, the economic policies should be dictated by the banks. And being privately owned, that was very controversial as well. He argued that non-political interests should control the money. Those that opposed this said basically you're giving lots of tax dollars money to favored money interests, to the elite bankers, and that's just not fair. Jefferson argued it was unconstitutional. He said nowhere in the Constitution does it say that you can have that Congress can establish a national bank. So therefore, Jefferson argued it's unconstitutional and you can't do it. Hamilton argued that establishing a bank is part of the implied powers that come with a statement in the Constitution that says Congress shall make any law that is necessary and proper for carrying out the enumerated powers. One of the enumerated or listed powers of the Constitution for Congress is to tax and spend. And Hamilton argued that it is necessary and proper, or implied, that if you have to tax and spend, you have to have a place to keep the tax money that you collect and a place to distribute it from for spending. So therefore, you need it's implied that you need a national bank. And in this debate, which ended up basically being decided by Washington, President Washington, Washington sided with Hamilton on this argument, and the bank was finally chartered in 1791. So that was a success for Hamilton, but his manufacturers report was defeated. Hamilton wanted a protective tariff to protect domestic industries, and that's what tariffs do. Tariffs make imported goods more expensive because you're placing a tax on foreign-made goods that are brought to the United States, and by placing a tax on them, it makes them more expensive for the person, the end buyer of that product. And so if you have uh, an established, let's say for instance, established shoemaking company in England who can make a shoe for $5 and ship it over to America and sell it for $10, and that's their profit with costs included. But America has a new shoe industry that isn't as efficient as the British shoe industry. Well, maybe their shoes cost $12 at the store. And so what you would do in order to promote, of course, if you go to the store and you see a $10 shoe and a $12 shoe, it doesn't matter for most people where it was made. You're going to buy the cheaper shoe, especially if they're basically equal in quality. So therefore, if that was the case, then people would buy the British $10 shoe and not the American $12 shoe, and therefore the American company would go out of business and jobs would be lost. That'd be bad for domestic industry. So what you do to fix that problem is you place, for instance, a $3 tariff on every pair of shoes that comes from England. So now that $10 shoe coming from England is a $13 shoe, and it sits on the shelf next to a $12 shoe from the United States, from America. And people, when they go to the store, they're going to buy the cheaper shoe. So they'll buy the $12 shoe. That means the shoe company in America will have to make more shoes because that's the shoe that's in demand, and therefore that'll create jobs and grow the economy. That's the whole point of a tariff, and that's a good thing because you're promoting domestic industry, you're creating domestic jobs. But the one downside of it, and this is the for those that argue against tariffs, is that the shoe costs more. Everybody pays $2 more for a pair of shoes than they would otherwise. Uh, Also, the tariffs and some of the things that Hamilton wanted, Madison and Jefferson worried about how much national power was being garnered by the new national government, and of course they believed in state power, and so they resisted. And Jefferson worried about agrarian rural suffering with this tariff because the farmers are the ones, and the rural people are the ones that end up having to buy the finished products, and those finished products would be more expensive with Hamilton's tariffs. One of the most divisive events that split the Federalists and the Jeffersonian Republicans during the early period of our country was the French Revolution. The French Revolution was an uprising of the masses against the monarchy in France. Now, the Jeffersonian Republicans, they favored France. They thought these revolutions amongst the people were just an extension of America's own revolution. Uh, and Jefferson has repeated historically always that revolutions occasionally are a good thing. So he favored France. Uh, Hamilton favored England. He was an Anglophile, if you will. He really respected and liked the English traditions. He respected their strong central government, and he thought basically that the French Revolution was chaotic. Uh, when the war started, well, during the French Revolution, after the French Revolution got out of hand and you started seeing mass executions and massacres, the British declared war on France. And when the Franco-British War breaks out in 1793, the United States declares itself neutral. Okay, they just they want to stay out of the war. That was their tradition. Their isolationist tradition really begins here. The isolationist tradition of the United States, meaning they just don't try not to get involved in foreign problems. Uh, but there were some issues here in the American mainland that created a problem with our neutrality. First, the British still occupied the Ohio Valley. one of the points of the Paris Treaty, which ended the American Revolution, was that the British had to leave the Ohio Valley, leave that frontier area, and they had not. And Jefferson and others argued that this was a violation of U.S. sovereignty, and a violation of the neutrality. So that was a strike against the British. Jefferson argued that we should punish England by supporting France, or at least attacking England and pushing them out of the Ohio Valley. Hamilton wanted to appease England, which means he wanted to just hold off and not punish them because they were such an important trade partner. They were an important political partner to us. And then later, um, the French had their own missteps with regard to their relationship with the United States. They actually sent a French diplomat named Edmond Genet, or as they called him later, Citizen Genet, uh, to visit the United States and to speak with ambassadors and to speak with higher ups in the government. And because the United States was a neutral nation, declared their neutrality, it was expected as a representative of a nation at war to respect that neutrality. But on the contrary, he went, especially into the South, went up and down the coastline trying to recruit uh, uh, people who owned ships and people who wanted to fight the war on the French side, and trying to basically stir up trouble along the coast, and especially in the South, in support of France in this Franco-British War. Now, this greatly angered George Washington, greatly angered Alexander Hamilton. Jefferson was embarrassed by it because he supported Genet, he supported the French, and even though he was a strong supporter of the French, he knew that Genet had crossed the line by overtly trying to recruit people in the United States to fight on France's behalf. And so he was finally Genet was finally expelled, but it was a big negative, this Genet controversy for the French in the United States, and it hurt their support in the United States. So there were reasons on both the French and the British side to support and not support their cause in the British Franco-British War during the French Revolution. Now, the Franco-British War started another problem. The United States, with its neutrality, and this will be something that will historically do. They will try to supply both sides, claim their neutrality, but profit by supplying both sides of a war. And they did the same thing here. They tried to supply the British and the French, and the problem being, though, that the British didn't like the Americans supplying the French didn't like the Americans supplying the British, and the British especially did something about it. They would seize ships headed for French ports, and and hold the cargo, and hold the naval crew. And so, because of this, and towards the end of the Franco-British War, the John Jay, remember one of the authors of the Federalist Papers, was sent to England to negotiate a treaty. Uh, and he was given a list of demands that that he was to try to negotiate. First, he wanted removal of Britain from American soil. Uh, Second, payment for seized ships, so reimbursement for seized ships. Of course, those removal from American soil are those British troops in Ohio Valley. More favorable commercial relations, because Great Britain was blocking the United States from trading in different parts of the world, especially the East Indies. Um, and acknowledgement of U.S. neutrality. Accept the fact that we are not going to come in on the British side in this war. So Jay went with this list of demands. The only problem is that Hamilton, and of course Hamilton, you remember, is a huge supporter of England, sent word through back channels that the U.S. was not firm on most of these points. Meaning, Jay is going to, he basically tells them that our negotiator is going to come in and negotiate for these demands, but the U.S. will take less. This is highly unusual, and it borders on treasonous because you're undermining the negotiations of an ambassador for a sovereign nation with another sovereign nation. So, but Hamilton went behind Jay's back and told Britain that the U.S. was not firm on any of these points, and of course the result of the treaty reflected that. There was no concessions by Britain whatsoever because they knew, based on Hamilton's secret messages, that that they didn't have to concede on anything. Uh, so basically, there was no guaranteed removal of Americans from British soil, no payments for seized ships, and no more favorable commercial relations. Washington disliked the treaty but signed off anyway. He just needed some kind of treaty with the British. Uh, and Washington was savagely criticized by the Republican press, as was the treaty itself. And it was really the first time in Washington's presidency that he lost that luster of invincibility and of you just don't criticize Washington. There were actually charges of treason on the sides of the Federalists who actually negotiated the treaty. Jay was a Federalist. There were charges of treason and saying you just sold out to the British and gave them everything. And it greatly increased the tension between the French supporting Jeffersonian Republicans and the British supporting uh, Federalists. Of course, as a new nation, we also have the ever recurring issue of Native Americans living and have been living for thousands of years, of course, in the areas that the United States now claims as their own, including um, newly established Ohio Valley. Uh, of course, the British, as we know, are still out there, and because there's still some resentment from the Revolutionary War, many argue that the British are still out there, and they're enticing the Indians and encouraging the Indians to attack American military forts and American settlements. And of course, the United States resented this greatly, and of course, it was a mark also against Hamilton for supporting the British. But the United States sent out its army into the Ohio Valley, and in a couple of different, well, in the main war was the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794. They finally defeated an alliance of multiple tribes in their attempt to save their land. And of course, it was their land first. And just goes back to a tradition of American, not just government, not American government, but colonial governments uh, negotiating treaties with Indians. Uh, the Indians, while they don't want to, they finally adhere to the tenets of the treaty, and then they move to another part of the land, and then once thinking that it's a settled treaty, and then once the British settlers and then later the Americans decide they want that land, well, they force the Indians to move farther west, farther west, farther west. So there's never any final treaty because the United States is always reneging on them, and it's a long, sad history of that. So the Battle of Fallen Timbers defeated the Indian Alliance. Treaty of Greenville basically forced the Indians to cede all of the Ohio Valley, or a large portion of it, to the Americans. And with that, the British withdrew back into Canada. Now, the United States also had another problem with the Mississippi River. Uh, while U.S.'s land, according to or U.S.'s claims, according to the Paris Treaty after the Revolution, went all the way up to the Mississippi River. On the other side of the Mississippi River was Spain, who controlled that area. Uh, Now, what would be Louisiana? What we know of as the Louisiana Territory now. Well, Spain assumed that Jay's treaty, which was very, very favorable to England, was an alliance with England. And Spain and England, just like France and England, are enemies. So Spain blocked access to the Mississippi River. They would not allow the farmers and the travelers to travel down the Mississippi River for purposes of bringing their goods to market or moving cargo and people. Uh, a guy named I think his name was Charles Pinckney was sent to negotiate an end to this problem, and he negotiated what was called the Treaty of San Lorenzo. Now, this was considered a successful treaty as opposed to Jay's treaty. Mississippi was open to U.S. traffic. The Florida border dispute, which had been going on for a long time on where the actual border of Florida was, because Florida belongs to Spain, that dispute was settled, and the Spanish stopped inciting Indian attacks, because that was one way in which the Spain and England and any foreign power that wanted to uh, limit the the settlement of the Americans was to encourage Indians and fund and help arm Indians against the continued westward movement of the Americans. But this negotiation stops Spain from continuing to do that. The map on the left shows the disputed claim area above Florida. That striped area was the Spanish claim that was disputed by the United States, and the Treaty of Greenville. I'm sorry, the Pinckney's Treaty of San Lorenzo, um, created that red line as the new border, which allowed the United States to gain more territory. And the map on the right shows the line of the Treaty of Greenville of 1795. The To the left of that is the territory that was gained through those specific battles, Indian battles, major Indian battles. The Battle of Fallen Timbers being the most famous of which kind of ended the Native American resistance. Now, as we've been talking about already, the political culture at the time and the politics of the time was highly, highly partisan. I mean, it was both sides saw the others as treasonous, especially when it came to their support for foreign nations like the Federalist support of the British and the Republican support of the French. It was highly partisan. There was no concept of the loyal opposition. The opponents were seen as disloyal and treasonous. And it was considered patriotic to absolutely destroy the opposing party. And that, you know, both parties today, we get a sense of that in a lot of ways. But there was, and one of the reasons why it was so partisan was that we'd kind of lost as a nation that common revolutionary purpose. Everybody came together during the American Revolution, at least the Patriots did, those that wanted separation from England, and had a common purpose and fought for a common goal. That went away after a few years once the war was over. Partisan newspapers became highly influential. The political parties actually funded most of the major newspapers. Therefore, the news in those papers was skewered and biased towards one political party or the other. And locally, on the local level, political clubs form. This was a new concept. In the past, party politics had been kind of an elite affair amongst the party leaders and those in government. But now, on the local level, you have political clubs forming, and these clubs were formed to provide the masses with information and to build a strong grassroots party support. While that was the early attempts at that, that really didn't come to fruition until later during the era of Jacksonian democracy, which we'll talk about in a little while. Now, also happening at this time were challenges to the power of the federal government and the national government. And the most important early challenge to the national government's sovereignty and to their power was the Whiskey Rebellion of 1794. Uh, Basically, in one of Alexander Hamilton's plans as Secretary of the Treasury to raise revenue was to place an excise tax, which is a production tax basically, on whiskey. Now, whiskey was an important product because it'll, you know, a lot of people, especially in Pennsylvania, grew wheat and barley and many of the products that would go into whiskey, but it was too cumbersome and too difficult to deliver those products, the actual raw materials of whiskey to market. So it was easier to distill it down into whiskey and and move it across country, across those bad roads, and get it to market. It was much easier than trying to sell the raw materials and getting them to market. The national government placed an excise tax on whiskey, and there was a lot of resistance from those that produced the whiskey, and they refused to pay the tax. And there was basically a revolt over this tax. And the Republican governor, of course, you know, Hamilton is a Federalist who implemented the tax. The Republican governor of Pennsylvania refused to act to force these people to pay the tax. It was seen by the Federalists as a conspiracy. It was a state conspiracy in their eyes to challenge and delegitimize the national government. Uh, Washington decided, well, you know, we are sovereign nation and we are supreme, and the federal law or national law is the highest law of the land. So he said this cannot stand. So he decided to send military regiments in to put down this what he called and what Hamilton might call an insurrection. And Hamilton, being the kind of closeted, you know, wanted to be a military hero his whole life, but never, you know, had the opportunity, saw this as his chance to, you know, lead a military expedition and become a hero. But by the time they reached Pennsylvania, uh, a few people were left to arrest. Most were pardoned. Most everybody else scattered. It was kind of anticlimactic, but the rebellion was put down. Now, as we get to 1796, Washington has served 2 terms. People generally had expected him to serve another one, actually serve until he died. That was kind of expected. But surprising to everyone, he stepped down after 2 terms. And that sets a precedent that all future presidents will follow up until Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s. But in Washington's farewell address is very important because it touches on a couple of things that uh, that were important at the time. First, he was sympathetic to the Federalists. He in his speech, it was Federalist ideas and Federalist concepts that he promoted and discussed. Uh, and it wasn't found out until later that this was probably because Alexander Hamilton wrote the majority of the farewell address, and of course Hamilton being the literal leader of the Federalist Party. He also warned against permanent foreign entanglements. This was an early principle of the U.S. government, this idea of isolationism and not getting involved in long-term treaties with other nations. Washington argued it was okay to have, you know, short-term arrangements for the benefit of your nation, but don't get into any long-term alliances because you never know uh, what may happen in the future. And so Washington steps down, and then of course we have an election in 1796. Two main candidates, John Adams, who was the vice president for Washington, Thomas Jefferson, who was the um, Secretary of State, at least the first part of Washington's presidency, Thomas Pinckney, and Aaron Burr. Now, in this system of the Electoral College, basically, if you look at these electoral votes, the members of the Electoral College who choose the president are asked to choose 2 people. They choose, theoretically, the president and the vice president from whichever party they support, but there's no designation of which one is the president and which one will be the vice president. And so, obviously, Adams and Pinckney were the choice of the Federalists, and Adams was the president. But in the case of you're choosing who you want for president and vice president, but in the end, whoever receives the most votes becomes president, and whoever receives the next most votes, the second most votes, becomes vice president. And so they could be of different parties. So what ended up happening was Adams became president, and Thomas Jefferson, who was of a different political party, became vice president. And that's going to create problems in and of itself. So Adams becomes the new president. Adams' presidency was quite a volatile presidency. It was just a one-term presidency, which we'll talk about in a minute. But it was a volatile presidency and divisive. As I said, Republican Jefferson was the vice president. And one of the problems was with Adams' presidency is that Hamilton, even though Adams was the president, Hamilton was still seen as the leader of the party. And the heads of the departments within the government, the Federalist heads of the department, tended to be more loyal to and more sympathetic with Hamilton than with Adams, and that undercuts the ability of a president to lead. One of the important events that happened during the Adams presidency was the XYZ affair. Of course, as you know, we still have the Franco-British War. France is fighting England. Of course, the United States is trying to maintain its neutrality. But once again, an impact of Jay's Treaty, which greatly favored England, was the fact that the French saw it, just like the Spanish did, as an alliance with England because it was so favorable to England. And so the French retaliate. They begin what is called a quasi-war or a sort of war or just kind of it's a war but not declared. And the French begin seizing ships just as the British did. That's common practice during wartime in this period in history. Now, in order to end this and put a stop to this quasi war, Adams sends some ambassadors to negotiate an end to it. And so these three negotiators show up in France, and they are not allowed to speak with the French foreign minister. Uh, these three diplomats demand bribes up front. They're called XYZ. These French diplomats demanded huge bribes up front just for the ability to go speak with the French diplomat. This, of course, word of this got back to the United States, and there was a huge uproar. The United States is just trying to get its footing on the world stage and trying to garner respect from the rest of the world, and this is just a kind of very disrespectful action by the French. And of course, this was used politically by the Federalists against the Republicans. Saying, "Hey, see your okay, you Republicans, see how your French are acting now." So that once again, it creates more divisions between the French supporting Republicans and the British supporting Federalists. Also, to put down this political dissent, Adams, of course, being a Federalist, wanted to stop the, uh, the minor revolts and the dissent in the press and the criticisms of his presidency. So he builds a standing army, which ostensibly, meaning what he says, is to protect against a French attack, but really it was to stifle domestic dissent, um, in case there was a true insurrection, in case the possibility of a true civil war with the Republicans, and there was really talk during this time about an actual civil war between the Republicans and the Federalists. So the, the the Republicans especially were very fearful of this new standing army which was established. Uh, Hamilton was seeking a declaration of war against France based on the XYZ affair. Now, along with establishing a standing army, the Federalist Congress, along with, of course, Federalist President John Adams, passed something called the Alien and Sedition Acts. The Alien and Sedition Acts. Basically, this act made it very easy to deport any foreign national, specifically French foreign nationals. That's what it was aimed at. But more importantly, it basically made criticizing the national government, of course, the only people criticizing the national government at this time were the Republicans, made criticizing the national government a crime that could be punishable by prison. So, and it was really the first civil liberties crisis, the first challenge to kind of the Bill of Rights, and of course it directly challenged the First Amendment rights to free speech and freedom of the press. But mainly the focus of these acts were the partisan newspapers that were run by those that supported the Republicans. So it basically criminalized criticism of the government, and many people were arrested. Now there was great backlash to this, especially amongst the more powerful Republicans, including Jefferson and James Madison. Uh, these two set about to challenge the validity of the Alien and Sedition Act, and they did so by issuing and writing and presenting the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. The Kentucky and Virginia resolutions were state arguments against the power of the national government and the Alien Sedition Acts. So the Republicans saw this law as a threat to liberty. They're thinking that if the national government can just make a law that makes it illegal to criticize the government, anybody in the states to criticize the government, well then that's just a recipe for tyranny. The Kentucky resolution says that states may nullify federal law if they deem it unconstitutional. So basically what they're saying here is the state, if the national government makes a law that the individual states deem unconstitutional, the states may nullify it. And that's a direct challenge to the sovereignty and to the supremacy of the national government. And the Virginia resolution urged states to protect its citizens, meaning basically in a very subtle way argued that the state should, with whatever means necessary, meaning military means as well, protect its citizens' rights to free speech and freedom of the press. And it really clarified the difference between the Federalists and the Republicans. Whereas, as we all know, we went back all the way early on in this chapter, the Federalists believed in a strong central government, a strong national government. They did not trust the masses, hence the Alien Sedition Acts. The Republicans believed in state governments. They believed in government by the masses, and they distrusted a strong central government, hence the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. Now, although Hamilton, who was the kind of the de facto leader of the Federalists, wanted war with France, Adams wanted to end the war, and it was a battle within the presidency and within the Federalist Party as to whose will would win. And in the end, Adams breaks with Hamilton and is able to garner up enough support within his own party and within the government to send a delegation to negotiate peace with France. And this being done, and the peace being being created, the Convention of Montfontaine kind of settles all the simmering problems domestically in the United States. And the war hysteria ends in some way. So this convention ends the war and creates a more trustful climate, kind of getting back to focusing on what's important, that stuff that's back here in the United States. And then we have an election. Once again, every 4 years we have a new election, and this election will take place in 1800. Of course, John Adams is going to run for re-election. He is he's kind of a vain person, and of course, anybody who becomes president wants to get re-elected to kind of validate their presidency. But Hamilton, who is also a Federalist, wants Thomas Pinckney over Adams. Okay, he wants Pinckney to win. And so he is doing his mechanizations behind the back of Adams, trying to get people to support Pinckney for president instead of Adams. Now the Republicans run Jefferson and Burr. Jefferson is the president and Burr is the vice president. Well, Jefferson and Burr tie. Remember, I told you the system of electing the president in the Electoral College back then was that each voter gets to choose two persons for their party, one for president, one for vice president, but there's no specification as to which one should be president or vice president. And so the Republicans were really too disciplined and too good because all of them voted for Jefferson and Burr, and it was a tie, so nobody knew what to do. I mean, everybody knew that Jefferson was the choice for president, but nowhere in the Constitution does it clarify, that one or the other would be president, and they did not expect a tie. So the vote goes into the House of Representatives, and actually Hamilton persuaded many of the Federalists to vote for Jefferson as president because Hamilton absolutely despised Aaron Burr. He just disliked him to his core. And so while he also wasn't a huge fan of Jefferson, he liked Jefferson and trusted Jefferson more than he trusted Burr. So Hamilton persuades members of the Federalist members of the House of Representatives to vote for Jefferson for president. And then to solve this problem, this tie problem that caused such a problem, they passed the government passed the 12th Amendment, added the 12th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which basically says we'll keep the same system of voting by electoral college, but when you vote for your two persons, you must specify which one is president and which one is vice president. Now, when when Hamilton realized he had lost the race and would not be president, and this election also turned over control of the Congress to the Republicans, so the Federalists have lost control of the presidency and lost control of Congress. What they wanted to ensure is that they did not lose control of all three branches of government. So Adams, well, at the very last minute, it's called the Midnight Appointments, Congress creates a whole bunch of new judicial posts. And of course, Congress has the power to do that by the Constitution. And of course, Adams, as the president, has the power to appoint members of the federal judiciary. So he appoints a bunch of Federalists to the federal judiciary. And as we know, that if you are part of the federal judiciary, you serve for life. So this was an attempt by Adams and the Federalists to gain control over at least one branch of government because they had lost the other two by election. And this was very, very controversial, and it created one of the most famous court cases in American history, and that is the case of Marbury versus Madison. But anyway, Jefferson had his inaugural. It was much different than Washington or Adams. It was very understated. Actually, he actually rode to the inaugural himself on on his own horse, whereas Washington had a coach and four, where it was like a wonderful ornate coach with four beautiful horses, and Adams was kind of a snooty kind of president as well. Jefferson was more down to earth, and his inaugural in his speech attempted to kind of bring everybody together. He was not critical of the Federalists. He tried to show a common cause for all Americans. Here's just a graph showing the election results, the Electoral College election results of 1800. Jefferson and Burr both getting 73 votes. Adams and Pinckney 65 and 64 respectively. Now, the Jeffersonian era. The election of Jefferson in 1800 ushered in a new era. The West becomes more influential as people move. Politics becomes more democratic. Jefferson's presidency is dramatically different than previous presidents, yet the lines that delineate Federalists from Republicans begin to blur, and the U.S. fights its first official war since the Revolution. This is basically a map that shows what the United States looks like as Jefferson comes into office. The green area, of course, is the United States of America. That kind of reddish, rusty-looking area is Louisiana, of course, which is controlled by France at this point. And then Spain still controls a huge swath of what is now Mexico and what will be the western part of the United States and Florida. And there's disputed claims up there in the northwest. And of course, that orange area at the top is British North America. Now, as we move into Jefferson's presidency, the republic is expanding. We're moving westward at a very rapid rate, and these regional identities begin to solidify. Meaning, these regions take on their own culture and their own identities. Of course, the New England, which is the most long-established region, is about commerce, and it's a Federalist stronghold. It's kind of an elitist kind of area. Now, this westward settlements in the Ohio Valley and onward, they're more just the average guy, and the average person is much more likely to support the policies of the Republicans. And so, as we move westward, it creates great pockets of support for Republican policies, and the two sides tend to start distrusting each other. And the population is growing. There's a 2 million increase in the United States' population from 1800 to 1810. 20% of these are slaves. 20% of these are black slaves. That's a huge, and of course, most of them are concentrated in the South. although there are slaves still in the North, and also there are some in, not a lot, but some in the frontier, the Ohio Valley. New states that entered the Union during this time: Kentucky in 1792, Tennessee 1796, and Ohio in 1803. Now, this Western culture that we talk about, it is rootless and optimistic. You know, back in New England and back in the traditional original Southern of the 13 colonies, people were tied to their land. The land itself was like part of the family. It had been settled by their ancestors, maybe those that came over early on in the early settlements of Jamestown and Plymouth, and so there was this important tie to the land. These Westerners had no ties to the land. They would find the best deal, try to accumulate more land, and if moving further westward means they could accumulate more land, sell the land they're on, and buy more out west, well, they would do it. They were rootless. They were willing to do anything to get ahead. But they were optimistic. They always thought there was a better day ahead. If we worked hard, uh, good things would come. Of course, as they're moving out west, as I mentioned before, there's always Native American resistance. There's always the Indians that are trying to protect their own traditional lands, their own families, their own tribes, and so they keep fighting. They keep fighting, but there's just really no chance for them to win against the might of the flood of refugees, not refugees, the flood of settlers moving out west, and then the support of the U.S. Army, which is going to um, back any disagreements between the Indians and the settlers. The U.S. Army is going to back the Anglo settlers or the American settlers, and so there were some final battles, and an end to some of the early final resistance. Tecumseh of the Shawnees was defeated in the War of 1812, and the Creeks were defeated by Andrew Jackson at Horseshoe Bend in the Deep South. Uh, Jefferson wanted the Indians west of the Mississippi. He did. He wasn't as harsh towards the Indians as some were. Now, as we know, Jefferson believed in the farmer was the key. The yeoman farmer that owned his own land was the key to the stability of the nation, and he thought that he could, if we sent the Indians out west on the other side of the Mississippi and allow them to learn how to be yeoman farmers, teach them the value of private property and owning their own farm and cultivating their own farm, that they would assimilate more quickly into the and being quote unquote American. The only problem is that whole concept of being a yeoman farmer and staying in one place and owning your plot of land goes completely against the culture and ancestry of Indians. They are they have this concept of communal land ownership, not of private land ownership. According to the Indians, nobody owns Mother Nature. You just it's for everybody to use, and you take what you need, and you know don't you know you don't harm it, but you don't own it. You just take what you need and move on. And nobody truly owns the land according to the Indians. So it was not something that was going to be successful. Now, cities were also becoming larger and larger. Uh, while 84% of the population was in agriculture, uh, that doesn't mean 84% of the population was farming. Many of their connections with agriculture and their involvement in agriculture was commercial, was shipping. Cities profited from shipping agriculture. The farm products would go to market, and the cities would ship them wherever they needed to go, all over the world, really. The main role of cities was international commerce, and of course, the United States, was based on the principles of mercantilism. That's how the original colonies were established, and so that culture took root, and so um, uh, the United States, as it still is today, is a commercial venture in a lot of ways. You see the early beginnings of industrialism, although that was seen as risky. Investing all your money in creating a product. It was still more profitable, especially in the South, to grow crops, especially cotton. Cotton will soon become the most important um, of all the products, and we'll see the problems that that creates. But it was most people thought it was too risky to shift their investments and their money from, say, growing cotton to industrialization or creating finished products like textiles or cloth from the cotton. Uh, but this early rise of industrialism frightened skilled craftsmen, those people who created things on their own. Uh, Say there was a seamstress, or I don't know if you'd call them seamstresses now, but a man who makes clothing at home. Well, um, he makes his living that way. But if textiles are industrialized, then they will be able to make them much more quickly and much more cheaply, and will put the skilled craftsmen out of business. Now, as Jefferson becomes president, as I mentioned before, his personal style is less formal. He uh, One of the things that traditionally Washington and Adams had done, and other leaders have done too, is they would, when there was like a formal dinner, they would put people, it would be a long rectangular table, and of course the president would sit at the head of the table, and and then based on how important you were in the eyes of the president or status wise, that's how close you would sit to the president. So those on the left and the right, that directly on the left and the right of the president in these rectangular tables, would be considered the most the most important people. Well, Jefferson, and so I guess if you sat at the long end, at the far end of the table, you were the least important. Well, Jefferson didn't like this idea, and so to the chagrin of many people and to the anger of many people, especially the British, uh, he would have his dinners at a round table, and so there was really no. You still, there were those that sat next to the president, but it wasn't as rigidly structured and as formal as it was in previous presidents. His goals as president were to reduce the size and the cost of government. He didn't believe in government debt, whereas Hamilton did. He wanted to repeal the Seditions Act and to keep the U.S. out of war. And he was a skilled politician. He wasn't a great orator. He didn't speak well in public, but he was a great negotiator, and he knew how to make people persuade people to come to his side. Uh, and so, what were some of the reforms what did Jefferson do differently? What were some of the things in his presidency that he was able to accomplish? Direct taxes were eliminated. Those excise taxes and things like that, uh, those were eliminated. He argued that we could just create revenue from customs, basically tariffs, trade taxes, taxes on trade, also selling land. That was an important revenue stream during this time. The military was cut dramatically. Remember, Adams created this standing army during his presidency, for the purpose of preparing for war for France, but really to to have the ability to squash any Republican uprising. So he cut the national military dramatically, and because he favored state militias over a standing army, he felt like state militias could do the job that a standing army could do. But he did understand the importance of strong military leadership and strong military education, and therefore he established West Point, which was an academy for training military officers, and the Army Corps of Engineers. Uh, and during Jefferson's presidency, Federalist support begins to collapse, and there's a lot of reasons for this, but really the main one is that the populating of the western states and these western territories, these are all populated generally with Federalist supporters, and as these with these Republican supporters, and as these Republican supporters and these territories out west become states, they get seats in the legislature and they get votes in the electoral college, and therefore you see the Republicans gaining support nationally. Jefferson's presidency is probably most noted for the Louisiana Purchase. The Louisiana Purchase, which basically will double the size of the United States. And initially, that was not the goal. What happened was France closed the port of New Orleans to shipping in some dispute with the United States. France closes the port of New Orleans, and that is a vital, vital port. You cannot, Mississippi being the blood lifeline, the commercial lifeline across the middle of the North America, closing that port has a dramatic economic impact on people living in the Ohio Valley. So France closes the port of New Orleans to shipping. Jefferson sees New Orleans as vital to U.S. commerce, correctly so. So he sends James Monroe and some others to negotiate the opening of the port of New Orleans. When they get there, of course, Napoleon Bonaparte is the leader of France at this time. When they get there, Napoleon is in a mood, a perfect mood for the United States to show up at the time because he is frustrated with the events that have been happening to him and his country in North America, and he's willing, he said, he'll sell all of Louisiana for $15 million. He's tired of what's going on in North America, and of course he needs the money to fight all his wars that he's fighting over in Europe. So Napoleon offers all of Louisiana for $15 million. Now Monroe doesn't know what to do. He's caught in a problem because he doesn't have the authority on his own authority to buy Louisiana. And also, there's a constitutional question. Does the president, through his ambassadors, have the authority to purchase foreign land? Well, Monroe could send word back to Jefferson and ask for permission to buy, but that would take too long, and he was fearful that Napoleon would renege on the offer. So Monroe did something very radical. He went ahead and agreed to the purchase. He agreed to the purchase without authority from the president, without authority from the national government, and went back. And at first, Jefferson was appalled. He's like, "Why did you do this?" Then he thought about it for a little while and realized what a great deal it was. Um, and so the purchase was finalized, and Louisiana became part of the United States, and like I said, almost basically doubled the size of the United States. Um, Also, when you buy the land, you buy the people there too. So they acquired not only the French land, but Spanish and French citizens. Of course, this new land is going to be settled eventually, and so one of the maybe the second most important things that Jefferson is known for, at least domestically, was the Lewis and Clark expedition. Uh, where they send these two explorers out to map the new Louisiana territory and to see what's out there. Uh, of course, Jefferson's purchase of this and his accepting of this was contrary to Republican principles. He, you know, Republican principles argue strict constructionism. If the Constitution doesn't say you can do it, then you can't do it. And nowhere in the Constitution does it say that you can acquire and purchase foreign land with foreign people, except through the treaties ending wars. And so Jefferson uh, starts leaning towards kind of Federalist principles as far as constitutionality of laws and the scope of the presidency and what they can do. Okay, here's a map that shows the Louisiana Purchase. That orange area is the Louisiana Purchase that was purchased for $15 million, which is a great deal. It's a lot of money back then, but it still was a great deal. Um, and then the red line is the Lewis and Clark expedition, which takes them all the way to the Pacific Ocean. It's one of the great explorations in history. Jefferson's first foreign crisis was the Barbary Wars. Uh, we had long been trading the colonies, even when they were colonies, before we became a nation and states, always traded with these North African nations in the Mediterranean Sea. And, uh, and as colonies, uh, these, um, these trading partners in North Africa had demanded tribute or money in order to access the the Mediterranean and its trading partners. Well, the British, when we were colonies, the British had always paid those tributes, but when we became a nation, an independent nation, we refused to pay those tributes. And under Jefferson, finally, those North African nations of Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and Tripoli, and places like that, they took offense and they began to demand us pay our tribute as well. And when we did not, they would seize ships, capture ships, and hold them until the tribute or money or bribe, all a tribute is a bribe, until the bribe is paid. Well, Jefferson refused to do it. First of all, we didn't have the money in the treasury to pay these types of bribes. And secondly, they regarded it on as principle that we shouldn't have to pay for the privilege of trading. So Jefferson sends a navy and blockades Tripoli and successfully bombards Tripoli and defeats the leader and forces concessions and the ability to trade without tribute. And it was our first successful, um, really foreign military adventure as a new nation. 2004 comes along. Jefferson runs for re-election. Once again, as we said, the Republicans are on a roll. They are garnering more and more support out west as these new states are established. Even in the New England areas, they are seen as the best option with regard to governing. And Jefferson the Republican just destroys Charles Pinckney, the Federalist, in the electoral vote, 162 to 14. Now I mentioned before the midnight appointments in the case of Marbury versus Madison. So let's talk real quickly about it. It's kind of a complicated case, but let's talk about it anyway. First of all, the Judiciary Act of 1801, as I mentioned, created a whole bunch of new judicial seats, and of course Adams has the power to appoint these these judges for life to these seats, and he appoints a bunch of Federalists in order to help, permanently establish a stronghold for the Federalists in the judicial branch. But by the time Adams steps down and his term is over and Jefferson takes over, Madison, of course, being his Secretary of State, not all of the appointments had been delivered. And so when Jefferson and Madison show up for their job, there's this stack of appointments, judicial appointments for Federalists to these newly created positions that that Jefferson and Madison have to decide what they're going to do with them. Well, they decide they're just going to throw them in the trash, and they're not going to deliver these appointments in order to help prevent the Federalists from taking over the judiciary. This guy named Marbury was one of the people who was supposed to get one of these appointments, and because he was refused and he felt legally that he had the right to his appointment to the position, he asked Congress. I'm sorry. He asked the Supreme Court to issue a writ of mandamus, forcing Jefferson and Madison to issue the appointment. Now, a writ of mandamus is basically a judicial decree forcing another person in government to do something. Now, this writ of mandamus was given. This power of writ of mandamus was given to the Supreme Court by I believe it was the Judiciary Act of 1796 by Congress, and so so that's basically the issue, is that whether the Supreme Court, which was led by a guy named John Marshall, would force the president, Jefferson, or at least issue a writ of mandamus telling him to give Marbury his appointment. Well, Marshall was a very smart person, but he also was very pragmatic. He knew, first of all, during this period, during the early periods of the Republic, the Supreme Court was the least powerful branch of government. It was the least respected, and it was just kind of there. And so he had a problem. He knew that if he issued the writ of mandamus forcing Jefferson and Madison to give the appointment, that they would just ignore him, because there is no tradition like there is today of people following what the Supreme Court says. So he knew the correct legal ruling was that Marbury should get his appointment, but he knew that if he told Jefferson to do it and Madison to do it, that they wouldn't, and that would just humiliate the Supreme Court and make their power even less. But he also knew that he had to make the right legal decision, because if he made the decision based on politics and not the correct legal ruling, then he would also it would delegitimize the Supreme Court. So here's what he did. He ruled the Judiciary Act of 1789 unconstitutional. 1789, I'm sorry, not 1796, 1789. Unconstitutional. Basically said Congress had no power to give the Supreme Court the power to issue a writ of mandamus. So basically, he denied Marbury's appointment, but in the process made himself and the Supreme Court much more powerful by setting the precedent of declaring something unconstitutional. He sets the precedent for judicial review because before this, no Supreme Court or nowhere had it ever said anywhere that the Supreme Court can declare an act of Congress unconstitutional. But he just did it, and it set a precedent for all future Supreme Courts to be able to do that, declare an act of the Congress or the act of the President unconstitutional. So that's the most important precedent set by Marshall during his term in office. Later, refusals to impeach judges protected independent judiciary. There were many, many times where the political parties, the opposing political parties, wanted to impeach federal judges because of their decisions, disagreed with their angered them politically, and there was early on there was a tradition set that you don't impeach judges for political reasons. You can only impeach them for criminal reasons. Now, with Jefferson kind of easing away from his hardcore Republican principles and embracing a few of the Federalist principles, that's going to create anger within his own party and challenges within his own party. And there was a group that challenged Jefferson called the Tertium Quids, and they argued that he wasn't Republican enough, that he was becoming too much like a Federalist. Of course, that's just the realities of being president. You can't hold to rigid ideology as a president, because once Jefferson wanted to tear down the army and strip the United States of its army, but he found out that if you do that, what if you need an army? What if you need a navy? And so anyway, other controversies or other important events that happened during Jefferson's presidency: Fletcher versus Peck, 1810. The Supreme Court may nullify unconstitutional state laws. Okay, so Marbury versus Madison gave the Supreme Court the power to nullify or declare unconstitutional acts of Congress. Now, this case gives the Supreme Court the ability to nullify state laws that they deem unconstitutional. Now, one of the more famous controversies during Jefferson's presidency was the issue of Aaron Burr. Aaron Burr was he was a power-hungry egoist who was always looking to get ahead, and he wanted to be governor of New York. And so, and of course, he was a Republican. Remember, he was vice president to Thomas Jefferson. Well, he switched to the Federalist Party because New York was a Federalist stronghold, and he wanted to be governor. So he switched parties in order to run for governor in 1804. Of course, Hamilton saw this, and of course, Hamilton, being a Federalist, was offended by the fact that a Republican like Burr, who he didn't like to begin with, was going to switch parties and switch to his party simply to win the election. So Hamilton, behind the scenes, blocked Burr's bid to become governor of New York. Burr is greatly offended by this and takes it as a personal affront, especially some of the things that Hamilton was saying about him to people. So he challenges Alexander Hamilton to a duel, which was, by this time, it wasn't very common. Duels weren't very common. They were still around occasionally, but people didn't duel as much as they had in the past. But anyway, so they go and they set out a time and a date for a duel, and now traditionally, especially when two elites or two important people in society are going duel, it is understood between the two that in order to save face, you show up for the duel, but both sides kind of shoot away from the other. Nobody tries to kill the other person. And Hamilton, was believed this was what him and Burr were going to do. Burr had no such inclination, and he actually took aim and killed Alexander Hamilton in their duel. Of course, charges were brought against him for murder, so he flees west, and while hanging out in the west, he meets up with some ne'er-do-wells and some troublemakers, and concocts this idea that they would separate parts of Louisiana from the U.S. and create their own nation. Of course, Louisiana Purchase, and Louisiana is now part of the United States. So by attempting to separate parts of Louisiana from the United States, that's treason. So he was later arrested and tried for treason, but acquitted because there were not enough witnesses against him. By 1803, Britain and France had resumed their wars, these called the Napoleonic Wars. Both were seizing U.S. ships, and of course that was not taken kindly by the United States. But one important event happened that caused great anger in the United States, and that was the USS Chesapeake being fired upon, boarded, and taken by the HMS Leopold, which was a British naval ship, right off the coast of Virginia. Basically, the British were looking for soldiers that had escaped British service, and were serving on American ships, and this was their reason for doing this. While the ship was not sunk, it created great uproar in the United States by the United States, and demanded war for against England. Uh, Jefferson, at this point, because remember he stripped down the military, refuses because he doesn't have the navy to go to war with England, and so since he can't fight a physical war with them, he will use economic uh, mechanisms to try to punish not only England but all players in the war, specifically France. And so um, Jefferson and the Republican Congress passed something called the Embargo of 1807. And basically, this policy prevents U.S. ships from trading with most all of the major nations that are at war or allied with the war-making parties in the Napoleonic Wars, and these are tended to be the most important and profitable trading partners for the United States. And this will probably go down as maybe the worst economic policy embargo in American history, because you know if France and England can't trade with the United States, well, they'll just buy their products elsewhere. But if the United States can't trade with major trading partners, they have nowhere else to go for the most part. So the purpose was to punish England and France. The result was to devastate the New England economy. And it made Jefferson very unpopular. It made him very unpopular, especially among the New England states and among the Federalists that was still somewhat of a stronghold for the Federalist Party. Uh, so anyway, with all this going on, he ended up repealing the embargo, but no, actually Madison repealed it after he became president. But once again, another election happened in 1808. Madison, who was Jefferson's Secretary of State, is elected president by once again by a significant margin. The Federalists really have no chance in these presidential elections these days. Madison defeats Pinckney 122 to 147 in the electoral vote. Once it's apparent the devastation caused by the embargo on the American economy, Madison and Congress repeal the embargo, and they implement other acts that attempt to punish the British for their transgressions and for the USS Chesapeake incident. Non-Intercourse Act, which called for neutral trade and no seizures, and the British initially agreed to it, but later reneged on it. And then Bacon's Bill Number 2 replaces the non-intercourse. Basically, Bacon's Bill Number 2 states that whichever agreed to a non-intercourse agreement, the French or the British, whichever agreed to treat us as equals and as neutral and continue trade with us, the other one will be frozen out from trade with the United States. Then Napoleon agreed, and then he reneged on that. So you have a lot of political maneuverings going on during this time. And now, moving towards war, Westerners out west accuse the British of stirring up the natives again. Sometimes the British, at least these war hawks, claim that these British would come down from Canada and stir up um, the Indians against against the United States. One of the major battles was at Tippecanoe, where Tecumseh was finally defeated by the United States. Of course, the hero of that war was William Henry Harrison, who would later be nicknamed Tippecanoe because for his exploits during this battle. The War Hawks demand war against the British. Madison asked Congress for a declaration of war, and once that happens, by 1812, the War of 1812 will begin, and of course it's that same year that Madison wins re-election to serve his second term, and it's beginning in 1812. Now, the War of 1812, we weren't really prepared for this. As you remember, Jefferson um, dismantled the military in a lot of ways to save money. He felt like the militias could handle it, but militias generally did not have navies. And in this era of world history, the naval power is maybe the most important power for fighting a war. But now the War of 1812, which is a war between the United States and Great Britain, the War of 1812 is a war between the United States and Great Britain. These militias would not be adequate. So Madison has to go on a quick building process to create a legitimate army and navy to fight the British. Now, the early attacks, the United States had planned some, preemptive early attacks on Canada, which is controlled by Great Britain, and those failed. But later, 1813, had a few successes. Commodore Perry seizes control of the Great Lakes, which is very, very important for this war because that is the major battleground for the navies at the time. The inland battleground will be on that in the Great Lakes, which are basically a series of lakes that create a division between Canada and the United States. Um, William Henry Harrison wins the Battle of the Thames after winning the Battle of Tippecanoe, and that increases his fame. Will launch him into the presidency. But the British are going to retaliate. Three-pronged British attack. They want to attack New York from Canada. They were repelled at Lake Champlain. They had a campaign in the Chesapeake, which is the Virginia, Maryland area. They actually are able to control Washington, D.C. and basically burn it to the ground. They occupied the White House and burned the White House. And but it was at Fort McHenry in Maryland that they finally held off the British, and that was kind of the turning point, if you will. Now, one note about Fort McHenry: there was a young officer standing off in the distance across the water, watching the Washington burn and how Fort McHenry was being held, and saw you know the cannon fire and the weapons going off, and he decided to sit down and write a song. And his name was Francis Scott Key, and the song he wrote while watching the Battle of Fort McHenry was the Star Spangled Banner. So our own national anthem was inspired by the Battle of Fort McHenry. Then finally the war ends, at least practically, in New Orleans, which was a very important port that was being defended by Andrew Jackson. The British wanted to control New Orleans. They knew if they controlled New Orleans that they controlled the Mississippi River and the flow of troops and supplies down the Mississippi River. But Andrew Jackson was able to defend the port of New Orleans against British attack. It's just a map of some of the battles of the War of 1812. You can see there Fort McHenry, what is now Baltimore, what was in near Baltimore burning, Washington D.C. burned. Looked far to the north of New York, you see Lake Champlain, where the Americans repelled the British. And then, of course, those orange lines, orange arrows, are where the United States early on attempted to attack Canada. And then finally at the bottom, it's the Battle of New Orleans, where the Andrew Jackson held off the British offensive and gained his fame, and will launch him to the presidency. As the war was progressing, the Federalists met in New England to propose certain constitutional changes. Now, the Federalists had been out in kind of the political wilderness for a long time, and they were looking to try to kind of rig the system in a lot of ways to help them win national elections again. And one of the things in the Hartford Convention that they proposed were some rules, changing the electoral process, uh, trying to make changes stating that you couldn't have more than one president successively from the same state, because I think 4 out of the first 5 presidents were from Virginia, which was a Republican stronghold. So they tried to create some changes. Now, once the war was over, and of course, they were greatly angered. The Federalists were greatly angered by the War of 1812 against Britain because it harmed their trade, and we were at war, this Republican war with their best trading partner, which was Great Britain. But once the war was over and we defeated Great Britain in the War of 1812, they were seen as disloyal. Many argued that they were even talking about secession of New England from the rest of the country because of their lack of political success. But because of their this perception that they were disloyal, the Federalist Party basically disappears after the War of 1812. Now, ending the War of 1812 is the Treaty of Ghent. It was ratified unanimously by the U.S. Senate. It resolved few problems, kind of left a status quo in a lot of ways. But one upshot of it is that it sparked a sense of nationalism that hadn't been seen since the Revolutionary War. If you recall, some of the earliest divisions between the Federalists and the Republicans stemmed from this lack of a common purpose, lack of nationalist sentiment, and this kind of renewed that. And of course, it produced future political leaders, Presidents Andrew Jackson and William Henry Harrison.